Despite scattered outbreaks of violence, a ceasefire appears to be largely holding in Ukraine. Shelling resumed in Donetsk and near the port of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov over the weekend, just hours after Vladimir Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart Petro Poroshenko spoke by phone. The European Union is poised to impose new economic sanctions on Russia, which were to go into effect on Monday, but said they could be suspended to allow Moscow more time to show it was resolving the crisis. Meanwhile, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev responded to the threat of new sanctions with a threat of his own, possibly preventing airlines from flying through Russian airspace if the US and EU press on with, quote, the temptation to use force in international relations. Later, we'll talk to the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations and a Russian scholar. But we begin in Ukraine with CCTV's Kate Parkinson reporting from Donetsk. And Kate, what is the state of the ceasefire right now?
Well, it's certainly quieter in the eastern regions of Ukraine since the ceasefire came into effect at 6 p.m. local time on Friday evening, but there have been a number of violations, the most serious of which happened at the weekend. Overnight on Saturday night into Sunday morning, there was heavy shelling to the east of the port city of Mariupol. Ukrainian armed forces said they came under heavy artillery fire from the rebels. Now, despite these violations, the ceasefire is still holding. Both sides say they are strictly adhering to the ceasefire, and both sides accusing their opponents of the violations. It's certainly shaky, but it is still holding for now. But what happens in the coming days is going to be crucial.
And as things stand right now, with this ceasefire largely holding, can you tell which side is prevailing in this conflict?
Well, certainly before the ceasefire came into effect, it was the rebels who had the upper hand. In recent weeks, they'd launched a major counter-offensive and had managed to push back the Ukrainian armed forces, breaking the siege that Ukraine had around the cities, the rebel strongholds of Donetsk and Luhansk. And certainly that crushing defeat that Kiev suffered on the battlefield is likely to have influenced their decision to sign up to this peace accord in Minsk last week. But now the situation with the ceasefire in place, there is danger that what we're going to see in eastern Ukraine is a frozen conflict whereby the active armed conflict has ended, but there's no political solution that the stakeholders agree on. So at the moment, it's not clear who has the upper hand.
And the pro-Russian separatists, are they one monolithic, unified group, or are there different groups, and are they all signed on to the ceasefire?
Well, that's a good question. There are certainly a lot of different battalions fighting here in the east, and they fall into two main groups, some fighting under the leadership of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, and others fighting under the leadership of the other breakaway region, the Luhansk People's Republic. Certainly there's no clear chain of command, although the field commanders that I've spoken to say they are willing to obey orders, and if they're told not to fight, they are going to obey that order. But certainly the role that Russia is going to play in pressing the rebels into line is going to be essential.
We now have the Minsk Agreement, the details of which were released by the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, the signatories to that agreement are calling for more power to go to Donetsk and Luhansk. What are we hearing about that?
Well, this was a very interesting development that came out of the accord that was signed by representatives from Kiev and from the rebel movement last week. And that was that there was going to be a call for a decentralization of power, a special status for these eastern regions, and even temporary self-governance. And that did imply that the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk were going to remain part of Ukraine. And actually, it was quite surprising that the rebels had signed up to that. But just this weekend, in the days that followed that agreement being signed, the rebels have said again that they are still pushing for full independence or union with Russia, but certainly not rule from Kiev. So still not entirely clear how the two sides are responding to that point in the peace plan.
Right, and we're also hearing something about a prisoner exchange. What can you tell us about that?
Well, this was another thing that was agreed upon in Minsk, and certainly it's been something that's been talked about throughout the weekend, both sides saying they were working towards it. Well, Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko has been in Mariupol today, and during his visit there, he said that the rebels had released 1,200 captives and handed them over to the Ukrainian side. Now, earlier in the day, a spokesperson for Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council said that both sides are engaged in the process, but he didn't give any details regarding numbers or timescales. Meanwhile, here in the east, a senior rebel leader has said today that the prisoner exchange is likely to continue through tomorrow and also Wednesday. Again, not giving any details on numbers, but did say that both sides were working on a principle of all for all, so that no captives were left on either side.
OK, thanks, Kate. CCTV's Kate Parkinson there, reporting from Donetsk.